Welcome back once again. We're studying through the life of David, as you well know, and Saul and Jonathan have just been killed in battle. Um, and David is about to be crowned king. I think he assumed he would just, take the throne of Israel as Saul had been king. That's not the way things are going to turn around. This is the second phase in David's life. The first was the path to kingship. And now this is him crowned king of Judah. He'll get crowned king of Israel a little bit later. We already know he's king of Israel, so not really a spoiler alert there. But right now, he will be crowned only king of Judah. And so we're going to take a look at how that comes to be. And he's going to honor some people. And he's going to take care of some business as well. So let's take a look at David as he's crowned king of Judah. We'll begin in 2 Samuel chapter 2. 2 Samuel chapter 2. We'll begin right at verse 1. We'll just read the first 7 verses to begin with. And it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said unto him, Go up. And David said, Whither shall I go up? And he said, Unto Hebron. So David went up thither, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail Nabal's wife the Carmelite, and his men that were with him, did David bring up every man with his household, and they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead, were they, excuse me, let me start that over. They told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead were they that buried Saul. And David sent messengers unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, and said unto them, Blessed be ye of the Lord, that ye have showed his kindness unto your Lord, small l, meaning King Saul, even unto Saul, and have buried him. And now the Lord shown kindness and truth unto you, and I also will requite you this kindness, because ye have done this thing. And what we're going to see is David honors the house of Saul as long as he's king. He's continually trying to do things to honor Saul's memory and people who helped Saul, and even Saul's descendants. Jonathan's son, we'll see he goes out and seeks a son of Jonathan that he may bless him as well. And so people are continually surprised that David honors Saul. This really is a tribute to David's heart attitude, I think, because the human circumstances were such that everybody assumed David and Saul were bitter enemies, and everybody assumed that David was just going to do what he could to take care of the house of Saul because of the way he treated him. And he turns around and takes care of the house of Saul. And this happens all the time. This is such an amazing attitude of humility in David, that though Saul was his enemy, in that he sought his life, though, as I said, I do think Saul did love David, just was so messed up. David also loved Saul's family. And we see that he's going to accept people who everyone else thinks that they deserve death, and that are enemies of David. And as David gains popularity, which he does over the next 7.5 years, he'll be king of Judah. At the end of 7.5 years, he's crowned king of all Israel. We'll get to that in a little bit. So he's going to gain in popularity as he goes, and so David just has this attitude towards Saul's family, and he loves them. And it's continually taking people off guard and by surprise. And we'll see at the end of this section of David's life as king of Judah that he really did love and honor his Lord, King Saul. He was the Lord's anointed, and he never forgot that. So David asks God, okay, the king of Israel is dead. Should I move into any of the cities of Judah? I'm not sure why he didn't immediately try to take over all of Israel. What he did do was he consulted God on what he ought to do next. A lot of his troubles were now over. we're going to get to the place where we come to the other side of the valley. And so we think, okay, the hard stuff's over. And too many times we just take it back on ourselves. Okay, God, I got it back from here. Thanks for the help. And we don't see that as David's attitude here. David, goes through all the difficulties with Saul. And he gets ready to be crowned king of Judah, at least, and he hopes eventually Israel. And instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to pick my city as my royal city, and I'm going to set myself up and eventually take over the place, we see the first thing he does when he learns of the death of Saul and Jonathan, rightful king and rightful heir to the throne of Israel, are now dead, that David goes to God. Should I go into any of the cities of Judah? And God says, go to Hebron. And so he does that. He takes his wives, he takes his men, he takes his men, the men that are with him, their families as well, and they start inhabiting Judah as a king, which we'll see happen here. He's getting ready to be crowned. David, his wives, their families, his men, his families, the men and their families moved with him to Hebron. And then we see there in verse 4 that the men of Israel anoint David to be their king. Now, this is, I think, an important distinction. This is not yet... God says, go ahead and move into Hebron. The men of Judah, not the prophet, anoint David king of Israel. And I don't know if there's any significance there or not, except that it seemed that that even though David was not yet to inhabit the actual throne of Israel, the men of Judah said, you're our king, even if it isn't totally official yet over the entire nation. You're our king. And so this is a great honor to David, that he should gain their trust and their allegiance, and they crown him king, even though it's not officially sanctioned by a prophet of God yet at this time. Then David honors the men of Jabesh Gilead, and I know we kind of rushed through the end of the death of Saul because I didn't really want to focus on the life of Saul. But if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 31, I want to read a couple of verses out of that actual account, because I think it's very, very important that we understand what David is doing here. Remember, Saul's been chasing down David. He's been trying to kill David. So from the outside environment and to the casual onlooker, and even to evidently people who were even intimate in David's life, assume that David is going to rejoice at this. And he does not. Look at 1 Samuel 31. We'll begin reading verse 8, and we'll read down to the end of the chapter. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. We already know this happened, right? And they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and they sent into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people, kind of bragging. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, their false god, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. So kind of a nana, kind of maybe striking terror into the hearts of the Israelites. We killed your king. Here's his body. We're better than you. We're stronger than you. And you're next, is the message they're trying to portray to this people. Excuse me. Verse 11. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, went all night, took the body of Saul, bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, came to Jabesh, and burnt them there. Why'd they burn them? I believe it was so that they couldn't desecrate their bodies any further. This was not an irreverent or disrespectful act. In fact, I think they were trying to save some dignity to the royal house in this action. Burnt them there, and they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Again, why no grave? Well, again, if we have a big monument to our former king, remember they haven't won the battle yet, really. By the time 1 Samuel ends, they could just go dig him up and do whatever they want. So they preserved the dignity of the house of Saul by burning the bodies, so no further indignities could be done, and they buried him under a tree, probably so that they really wouldn't be able to find him. But so we see that these valiant men, it took some courage to step out and do the right thing. And so David honors these men for their act of courage, for their valiance, for their service to Saul even posthumously. And so David blesses them. David rewards them because you have done this thing, he says in verse 6. Let now your hands be strengthened, be ye valiant, for your master Saul is dead. Also the house of Judah have anointed me king over them. And basically, he's giving his credentials to be able to reward them and say, you've done this thing under my predecessor. And because of that, as your king, I'm going to see that you're blessed for it. You're rewarded for your service to the Lord's anointed. So we see David honors them for that. So we get back into 2 Samuel chapter 2, and we pick up our reading in verse 8. And we find that David is going to be denied kingship of all Israel. I sort of think he thought maybe, okay, the Lord's worked this out. The king is dead. It's my turn. But that is not how it works out. And how many times in our own minds do we see the plan of God? God must be working this way. And sometimes there's maybe a dip in the road that was hidden. We didn't exactly see was going to happen. And David has to wait 7.5 years to be crowned king of all Israel. So let's take a look at this here. We're going to talk about two characters. We're going to talk about Abner, and we're going to talk about Ishbosheth. Now, Abner, we're going to find, he's faithful. But he's faithful to man and not faithful to God, and it's going to cost him his life. We'll talk about that. Spoiler alert, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. And then we see Ishbosheth, who is a son of Saul, his youngest, that did not go to battle, did not die in battle. He remained home, and he is 40 years old at the time, so I'm not sure why he wasn't in battle, except perhaps there was always a precaution that you leave a royal member male family, the royal house home. I don't really understand the culture and customs just from reading scripture, but the point is he wasn't there, he wasn't killed, and so he's got some big ideas himself. So let's take a look at this story here. 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, in fact, that's what Abner means. Abner means son of Ner. Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead and over Asherites and over Jezreel and over Ephraim and over Benjamin and over all Israel. So Abner is being loyal to Saul, his lord, right? Small L. He's being faithful to the royal household. There is a human tradition of the right of succession that the son should follow the father in sitting on the throne of a nation. And Abner is just carrying out faithfulness, and he's faithful to Saul's memory even after his death. The problem is this wasn't God's program. He was faithful to a man, and we're going to see that in the end, it's going to cost him his life. But he's faithful. The problem is he put his faith and his trust in the wrong thing. And we're going to see that this plays out very tragically. Abner's a very tragic character in these stories. But Ishbosheth, he's all about it. Oh, hey, I get to be king now. And we see that he's going to make some key mistakes in what he does. Verse 9, he's not a very smart individual. Verse 10, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David, because David was God's man. David had been anointed as king of Israel. David should have been next in line. In fact, Jonathan, who was the crown prince, succeeded his right to the throne to David. So in every sense, David should have sat on the throne of Israel. Not only that, David married Michal, Saul's daughter, so he was a son-in-law to the king as well. So there should have been some sort of path. Now, I do know Ishbosheth was a natural son of Saul, so I do understand that. But from every angle, it seems like David should have just stepped up and said, okay, I'm next. And that's not what happens here. Look at verse 11. Verse 11. He says, and at the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So he's king of Judah only for almost 8 years. We're talking about the better part of a decade here that David does not get what he feels like he's promised. And yet, what is David's reaction? How does David react to this? Well, number one, I don't see anywhere that says David just kind of fussed and fumed about only being king of Judah. He was faithful, in fact, in his duties. He had been faithful as a shepherd. He had been faithful in obedience to his father, went and checked on his brothers, killed Goliath, went right back home, was faithful. We see this pattern, humbleness of faithfulness in David's life. There's absolute grace throughout most situations, barring one very famous one, which we'll get to a little bit later. This is just David's life pattern. This is the way he's built, and so he becomes a musician, a court musician, and a general in Saul's army. Yes, sir. Saul wants to kill me. He remains faithful to Saul. He leaves. He goes. He becomes king of Judah. He's faithful as king of Judah, and he gets promoted again to king of all Israel. Here we'll see in just a few matter of a few verses. But here we see David's faithfulness. We may not get everything we think we deserve, everything we think we ought to have. We may not get ourselves the position. Maybe somebody else got the position that we thought we should have gotten. We have to remember that God's program does not always feed us all the information about that program, and we cannot just assume certain things in life. We have to trust that when things in life work out the way they do, that God has a plan for that, for those circumstances and those situations in our life. We know all things work together for good. Sometimes that's quoted in times of tragedy and loss and whatnot. The Bible doesn't say everything's good and so your life's going to be honky-dory. The Bible says all things work together for good. All things are all the things, not just all the good things. It's all the things, the good things, the negative things, and God has a way of taking this good and this bad, and sometimes even our sin is included in that, and somehow, in his great goodness and grace and mercy and just absolute omnipotence, he takes this, what looks like a huge mess to us, and works it for our good and his glory. What an awesome God. What an awesome, awesome, awesome God. So now we're going to run into some trouble here in verse 12. Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met together by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, the one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. And Abner said to Joab, Abner is on Saul's side. Joab is David's general. We'll find that out a little bit later. Excuse me. And Abner said to Joab, let the young men now arise and play before us. Now, when he says play, he doesn't mean, he's not trying to put together a play date. What he means is war games, but this is to the death. This isn't an exercise. He's saying, why should we kill off our brethren? Let's have a 12-on-12 match, and whosoever wins is whosoever wins. We see that God's going to kind of intervene here. Excuse me. And Abner said to Joab, and Joab said, let them arise. Verse 15. Then there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, which pertaineth to Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And they caught every one his fellow by the head, and thrust his sword in his fellow's side, so that they fell down together. Wherefore the place was called Helkath Hazurim, which is in Gibeon. Now, a couple things. Man's plan didn't work out. Joab and Abner said 12 on 12, and all 24 died. So now what do you do? Well, they actually ended up naming the place in honor of the event, Helkath Hazurim, and it means field of swords. Field of swords. And you'll find that a lot of times in the Bible, when something is named something, it's named for an event or an action or a famous person, something like that, or perhaps a geological feature, those sorts of things. So field of swords, this 12-on-12 match failed, and it was named something in memory of the event, Helkath, whatever, Hazurim. All right, so that's as good as you're going to get from me. Excuse me. So we kind of have this match, and it fails. So now what's going to happen? Verse 17, and there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten, and the men of Israel before the servants of David. This 12-on-12 match fails. I think some tempers started to flare, and so they go to war, and David's men beat up on Ishbosheth's men. Verse 18, and there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was light of foot, as wild as a roe. So he was a crazy man. And so we're going to take a look at these three brothers because they're going to serve as key characters in some of the stories here over the next few accounts. Excuse me, verse 19. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand, nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, Art thou Asahel? And he said, I am. He recognized him. He knew this kid. All right. And Abner said unto him, Turn thee aside to thy right hand or to thy left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armor. But Asahel would not turn aside from following of him. And Abner said again to Asahel, Turn thee aside from following me, wherefore should I smite thee to the ground? How then should I hold up my face to Joab thy brother? Howbeit he refused to turn aside. So he's been told twice to leave him alone, stop following after me. All right. Wherefore Abner, howbeit, verse 23, he refused to turn aside. Wherefore Abner, with the hinder end of the spear, smote him under the fifth rib. That the spear came out behind him, and he fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. So leave me alone. He didn't leave me alone. Leave me alone. Go bug one of the other guys. He didn't leave me alone. And he ends up. This is an act of anger. Abner struck him, but he struck him. This was no just love tap. He stabbed him so hard the spear came through his other side. I mean, that takes some doing. He went and in anger thrust him through. Verse 24. Joab also and Abishai pursued after Abner, and the sun went down where they were come to the hill of Ammah, that lieth before Giah, by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. And the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together after Abner, and became one troop, and stood at the top of the hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, Shall the sword devour forever? Knowest thou not that we will be bitterness in the latter end? How long shall it be ere thou bid the people return from following their brethren? And Joab said, As God liveth, unless thou hadst spoken, surely then in the morning the people had gone up every one from following his brother. So Joab blew a trumpet, all the people stood still, and pursued after Israel no more, neither fought they any more. Abner finally comes to his senses. I sort of think he was afraid maybe of Joab's reaction to his brother being killed by him. It doesn't say that, but it would kind of make sense. And Abner keeps getting beaten and more, so there's that tidy fact as well. Verse 29, Abner and his men walked all that night through the plain and passed over Jordan and went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. Joab returned from following Abner, and when he gathered all the people together, there lacked of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. So David only lost 20 people in the whole thing. But the servants of David had smitten of Benjamin and of Abner's men, so that 360 men died. David lost 20 men. Israel lost 360 men. And they took up Asahel and buried him in the sepulchre of his father, which is in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at the break of day. So they bury Asahel. Now, this is going to play into a later story in this account, because Joab is angry about this, and you can imagine you would be as well. So I wouldn't say it's unjust anger, but some things are going to come about as a result of this incident here. We'll talk about in a future at a future time. So Abner, Israel fight. They have a 12-on-12. It explodes into a full-scale battle. Abner and Ishbosheth. These names are not as easy to pronounce as I make it sound. Ishbosheth and Abner retreat to Mahanaim. David goes back to Hebron after a brief stopover in Bethlehem to bury Asahel. By the way, David ends up using people that he knows well, I believe. And I'll show that later on when he starts to set up the temple worship and whatnot, which we're not going to get into great detail here as in this go through. But there's some references in Chronicles that talks about how he set up the worship system once he's established king. And I think it's interesting because he uses people he knows, people from Bethlehem. And this seems to be a pattern in his administration. He's king of Judah, And Joab is from Bethlehem. Remember, if you'll recall, David also was from Bethlehem. It's likely the families knew one another even before all this went down. And excuse me. So this is going to become a pattern in David's life and in the way he administers his reign and gets his help and his under leadership. Is by and large going to be people he knows and trusts. And I just think it's kind of interesting because we read these names in the Bible, which are just another names. Joab was David's general. Awesome, great. But it's likely they knew one another. So Joab's loss is David's loss. Joab lost his brother. David lost a friend of his as well. And I think that that's important to remember, that when we see stuff happening to David, there's ups. Yeah, you get people you trust, but the downs is when something horrible happens. It affects friendships, which touches the emotions much deeper. And so I think it's very, very important to keep these relationships in mind as we go through. These are not just Bible stories. These things actually happen. These people had families, they have backgrounds, and they're interrelated. And that affects David and how he rules and the things that he does. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So we see then that they bury Asahel, they return to Hebron. So we're now in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, chapter 3, and we see that David is going to begin getting stronger, and he starts having children. And verses 1 through 5 name the children and their mothers. Remember, David has more than one wife. But we'll take a look here. This is as king of Judah. He gets crowned king of Judah and has 6 kids. Okay? Craig family's not that weird. That's all I'm saying. All right? You have Amnon. We're going to hear a lot more about Amnon in the future. Gilead. All right? We hear nothing else about him. And it sort of makes me wonder if either he was maybe just kind of a coward or if he died young. Because we know Amnon, we know Absalom tries to do something. I believe Adonijah might try something as well. I can't remember. But we never hear of a throne attempt from Gilead. Ever. He's just he's mentioned here, and it's the last time we hear of him. And so interesting, I think, because he features not at all in anything, and it makes me wonder, maybe he died young, or I'm not sure. Adonijah, Shephatiah, and Ithream. So these 6 boys are born to David after he's crowned king of Judah, after the skirmish at Gilboa. There seems to be some peace between Israel and Judah at this time. After this skirmish is settled, Abner says, stop it. We're killing our brother, and this is stupid. You have your king, we have our king. Let's just leave it alone. They say, fine. David goes back to Hebron. Abner goes back to Mithraim. And so we see that David begins to have children and starts to strengthen his royal line, to say the least. All right, so verse 6 now, something interesting happens here. We're not done with Abner's story. This isn't just go back to Mithraim and live your life until you die. Abner is a tragic, tortured character. Verse 6 then of chapter 3 says this, and it came to pass there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine? This was Abner. Then was Abner very wroth with the words of Ishbosheth, and said, I am a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day to the house of Saul, thy father, to his brethren, and to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman? So do God to Abner and more also, except as the Lord hath sworn to David, even so I do to him. Abner knew David was supposed to be king of Israel, but could not get over his faithfulness to man. We need to be really careful. Abner knew what God swore to David. I'm going to follow that now. And it took this false accusation from Ishbosheth to wake him up from following the house of Saul. And I think at this point, Abner realizes that years of faithful service and even willingness to fight brother against brother to secure the line of Saul was never going to be enough. And there are some people in our life that no matter what you do, no matter how much time you give, no matter how many finances you give, no matter how much of yourself you give, it's just never enough. It's just never enough. And I think Ishbosheth was one of these people. Kind of maybe very self-centered, and I don't know where he would have learned that from. And just one of these people that was suspicious of everything and everybody. And Abner says, really comes to the realization, rather, that doesn't matter how awesome he is in his faithfulness and his service to Saul and even to Ishbosheth. It was never going to be enough for Ishbosheth. And he says, you know what? God promised David the kingdom. What God promised, I'm going to get behind. I'm going to get behind that. But we had best get behind God's program, because some really, really horrible stuff is about to happen now. And really, I believe that had Abner been behind God's program to begin with, a lot of this would never have happened. Let's take a look then at let's pick it up at verse, verse 12. Verse 12, and Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, Whose is the land? Saying also, Make thy league with me, and behold, my hand shall be with thee, to bring about all Israel unto thee. And he said, Well, I will make a league with thee, but one thing I require of thee, that is, thou shalt not see my face, except thou first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when thou comest to see my face. And David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, Deliver me my wife Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. This is so funny. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel, son of Laish. So King David is ordering around King Ishbosheth, and Ishbosheth's doing it. Something about Abner's defection robbed Ishbosheth of security and sense of authority. I really kind of wonder if it isn't Abner throwing God into the equation before Ishbosheth that sort of does this when he leaves. What God promised to David, I'm getting behind that. And Ishbosheth, I think at this point, fears and trembles for his position as king of Israel. David orders him to give him his first wife that Saul gave him, and Ishbosheth just ups and does this. Now I kind of get a picture in my head of how the situation goes, and it sort of makes me chuckle, because I feel like Phaltiel is just kind of like a simpering, whimpering, but she was my woman, kind of a person, all right? And read the Bible with some imagination, all right? It comes alive to you when you do. But let's take a look at verse, I think it's 17. Abner had communication. Oh no, verse 16. So he took took her away from Phaltiel, and her husband went with her along, weeping behind her to Bahurim. Then said Abner unto him, Go, return, and he returned. So he's like, Oh, my wife, my woman. Which, I mean, I sort of get that, but it's clear that Michal was David's. He had no right to her, no claim to her. And Abner says, Go home. And he does. And I sort of kind of see that. It just makes me chuckle on the inside. Maybe you don't think it's funny, but I think it's hysterical. The whole thing that Phaltiel is, my wife, and Abner's like, Go home, be a man, get out of here. And he goes and he returns home. Verse 18 then picks up, now then do it, for the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines, and out of the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spake in the ears of Benjamin. Abner went also to speak in the ears of David at Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel, and all that seemed good to the whole house of Benjamin. So Abner came to David to Hebron, and 20 men with him. And David made Abner and the men that were with him a feast. So you know, Abner kept his word. David kind of seals the deal with a feast. All right. Verse 21, And Abner said unto David, I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel unto my lord the king, that they may make a league with thee, that thou mayest reign over all that thine heart desireth. And David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So David knew he was to be king of Israel, and David knew that this was God's plan, and he waited patiently for God to bring about his plan. We don't see him trying to make assassination attempts at Ishbosheth. We don't see him unhappy and weeping and wailing and stomping and fuming and fussing about not being king of all Israel. He rules well what he has, trusting that God will fulfill his promises. And this is a lesson to us. If we take care of what we have, the business God has given us to do now, he will bless us with his ultimate program. It's promised. Sometimes we just rush ahead of God, and we look back and we wonder why we felt like what God put in our hearts never came to pass. We wonder why God doesn't speak to us in the way we thought he was going to, or we mistake the voice of God because of following men like Abner, or we just don't see the plan, and so we assume that God has stopped talking to us. And I'm here to tell you, be faithful where you're at in what you're doing now, and God will show you more. God will show you more. That's such an important lesson in David's life. And he's really got this lesson down, and it's a pattern in his life that he does well where he's at, and God blesses him with more. He does so well. Verse, let me see here, verse 22, he sends Abner away, and he was gone in peace. This is important. It's an important little prepositional phrase, because some things are about to happen that are very unpleasant. Look at verse 23. Then when Joab and all the host that was with him were come, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, What hast thou done? Behold, Abner came unto thee? Why is it that thou hast sent him away, and he is quite gone? Thou knowest Abner the son of Ner, that he came to deceive thee, and to know thy going out and thy coming in, and to know all that thou doest. And when Joab was come out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah, but David knew it not. So Joab is angry with David. He's just here to spy on you. How can you be so foolish? Why can't you see this? David and Abner left in peace. And Abner says, Oh no, this is not happening. And he takes matters into his own hands. Verse 27, David has no idea this is going on. Verse 27, when Abner was returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly, and smote him there under the fifth rib, that he died, for the blood of Asahel his brother. And afterward, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord forever from this blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab, and on all his father's house, and let there not fail from the house of Joab one that hath an issue, or that is a leper, or that leaneth on a staff, or that falleth on the sword, or that lacketh bread. So Joab and Abishai his brother slew Abner, because he had slain their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. And so David is going to be very upset about this. You can imagine. He left a man in peace. This is cold-blooded murder. Now, as far as Joab is concerned, this was retribution. I think the devil placed a bitterness and a distrust in Joab's heart because Abner killed Asahel, his brother, but this ends up turning around and he just flat out murders him. Joab and his brother end up murdering Abner pretty much in cold blood. And he's telling David, he's deceiving you, he's a spy, but the scriptures are clear. He ends up killing Abner because Joab killed Asahel. Let's look at let's see what David does about this. Verse 28. And afterward, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord. Verse 30. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, slew Abner because he had slain their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. And David said to Joab and to all the people that were with him, Rend your clothes and gird you with sackcloth and mourn for Abner. King David himself followed the bier. A bier was basically a funeral wagon, basically. So oftentimes it was set on fire. Sometimes it was just a ceremony for important people. We kind of see that even in today's society. When Diana was killed, the carriage with her body was hauled through the streets of London. This would have been more open than that, but that's kind of the idea. And they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented over Abner and said, Died Abner as a fool dieth? Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him. And when all the people came to cause David to eat meat while it was yet day, David sware, saying, So do God to me and more also, if I taste bread or aught else till the sun be down. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them. David's character just shines here. And people were pleased that David would react to what some thought was an enemy in this manner. For 37, for all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not the king to slay Abner the son, that it was not of the king to slay Abner the son of Ner. And the king said unto his servants, Know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? And I am this day weak, though anointed king. And these men, the sons of Zeruiah, be too hard for me. The Lord shall reward the doer of evil according to his wickedness. Now, what was the doer of evil? It was Joab and his brother, David's own general. The people did realize that he had genuinely forgiven and accepted Abner. And this also made the people realize that he honored Abner as a prince of Israel. This was an important step because David is not yet king of Israel. They also saw their king as an honorable man. So we're going to see that one good turn deserves another, as these things often turn out to be. So in chapter 4, verse 1, we see a couple of people. When Saul's son heard Abner was dead in Hebron, his hands were feeble, and all the Israelites were troubled. He really was the backbone of his administration. He probably had hoped at some point Abner would turn back to his side, and that hope is completely vanquished. His hands were feeble, all the Israelites were troubled, and Saul's son had two men that were captains of bands. The name of the one was Baanah, and the name of the other Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, a Beerothite, of the children of Benjamin. For Beeroth also was reckoned to Benjamin. And the Beerothites fled to Gittaim, and were sojourners there until this day. And Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son that was lame in his feet, for he was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul Jonathan out of Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So the storyteller here is introducing a character that we'll talk about later. Verse 5, And the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, went and came about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth. There's too many multi-syllable names here. Ishbosheth, who lay on a bed at noon. So he is kind of taking a chill pill. This is not uncommon. This is not necessarily a laziness thing. You've got to remember, in the Middle East, it gets really hot over there, and it was very common for these folks to do something similar to a siesta, of kind of getting in shade and laying down and resting during the heat of the day. And once the heat of the day is over, they would resume some work before the evening would come. So here they are. Here he is in the heat of the day, and verse 6, And they came thither into the midst of the house as though they would have fetched wheat. So they came stealthily, they came deceitfully into the house of Ishbosheth, and they smote him under the fifth rib. And Rechab and Baanah his brother escaped. For when they came into the house, he lay in his bed in his bedchamber. They smote him and slew him and beheaded him, and took his head and gat him away through the plain all night. Now, evidently, this news of how David blessed the men of Jabesh Gilead never reached these fellows' ears. Because once again, people assume that in fighting for David's cause, it means striking out against the family of the Lord's anointed. And we're going to find David's reaction is quite the opposite of what they anticipated. We see verse 8, And they brought the head of Ishbosheth unto David to Hebron, and to the king. Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the Saul's son, thine enemy, which sought thy life, and the Lord hath avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and of his seed. They think they're doing God a favor. God's got this worked out. But these people jump ahead. Verse 9, And David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, and said unto them, As the Lord liveth, who hath redeemed my soul out of all adversity? David points back to God and said, God's my rescuer. When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag. Who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings? How much more when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? Shall I not therefore now require his blood at your hand, and take you away from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they slew him, cut off their hands and their feet, and hanged them up over the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. Abner and Ishbosheth, they were a family. What is not clearly delineated here is that Abner was actually a cousin of Saul. So Abner would have actually been a second cousin to Ishbosheth. But they took his head from the men. They killed the men. They buried his head in the sepulchre of Abner, Saul's general. So we just have all this intrigue, all this stuff going on, and people striking out, and now they think they're going to help God's plan that they had ignored for so long. All of a sudden, now this is God's will. This is the way it's going to work out. And it isn't. People jumping ahead of God, and people are getting hurt. People are getting killed, and it's really it's sad. David is horrified that someone would jump ahead of God and kill an innocent person in his own bed, and so he exacts retribution for the killing of Ishbosheth. So that closes out David as king of Judah. With Ishbosheth's death, no one else dares to try to take the throne of Israel, and David now is in a position to be offered kingship of all Israel. And we see that happen in chapter 5. Then all the tribes of Israel, then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, thou shalt be captain over Israel. These people knew this all along. Verse 3, So all the elders of Israel came to the king in Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 30 and 3 years over all Israel and Judah. So we see that they crown David king of all Israel, and so he reigns for 40 years total, 7 years in Hebron over Judah, and another 33 years as king of Israel, so 40 years and altogether. He's 30 when he is crowned king of Judah, meaning he lives to be a good old age for folks of this time period. He lives to be 70 years old. Some simple math there. So David moves to Jerusalem. There is some resistance and some prejudice about that. We don't really need to go into a lot of that. The Jebusites, who were the original inhabitants of the Jerusalem area, wanted a cleansing of the handicapped. And David ignores their request for whatever reason. He moves in anyway. So he moves into Zion, the city, and calls it the city of David, which, by the way, it's known to this very day. Jerusalem is known as the city of David. He builds a palace in Jerusalem. So let's look at chapter 5 and verse 11. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons and built David a house. And this is going to be the same king that's going to help David's son in sending supplies for the temple years later. All right. But this time he helps David. He finds him to be a friend, and he offers in friendship such things as he needs to build himself a palace. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. This was not about David. This is about who would best lead the people of God. And David's going to forget this on a couple of different occasions. But generally speaking, he operates this way. That these are God's people that I'm shepherding. As I shepherd my father's sheep as a lad, I shepherd my father's sheep as an adult. And he treats the job just like that. So David understood God blessed him. He was blessing his people. He married wives of Jerusalem and produced more children. So we have, I think it's 7 more children that are, more than 7. 3, 6, 9, 12 more children. 12 children. See, he has nothing. The Craig family's got nothing on King David. But as king of Israel then, he marries some women of Jerusalem and has more children. Shemiah, Shobab, Nathan, who I believe is named after Nathan the prophet, but I don't think it's actually ever specifically stated. Solomon, who it will become next king. What is he? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th son. The 10th son of David it becomes the next king of Israel. I think that's very, very interesting, and I think there's a picture of God's grace here. But Solomon, Ibar, Elishah, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet are the other sons that David has after he becomes king of Israel and moves into Jerusalem. And that is where we're going to wrap up this class, because we're going to move into some other things. And we're going to talk about some really, really neat historical things also in the next class, which I'm really excited about. Not everything's going to be honky-dory for David. Even after he's crowned king of Israel, some things are still going to happen. Some bad things are still going to happen. And we're going to see how David reacts to those things. We're going to take a look at some more of the Psalms of David as well in the next classes. So that's where we'll leave off today.